Welcome back to Seekistan, and welcome back to a little bit of a different S&C Coaches React today. Today's more of an in-depth analysis, a kind of post-hoc analysis of what Eddie and Hafthor did for their S&C training leading up to their kind of infamous debut only the past weekend. So we obviously, everyone knows the result by now. Hafthor beat Eddie in quite a show of dominance, I think, from most people's point of view. And what I want to do today is look back over the last essentially 2 years of their kind of performance and what they did leading up to this fight. Now, we're not doing this in the manner where we're going, aha, got you, and putting context with the answer already in mind. So hindsight is 2020. So we don't want to do that. We want to do this in a scenario where, let's pretend both of these athletes came and sat down with us, and we wanted to do a post-comp analysis of what they did leading up to the fight, so we can see where they went wrong or what they did very, very well. So then leading up to their next fight, we're pretending this scenario, if they're going for the next fight, what worked quite well and what didn't go so well. So we're not doing this as a kind of a gotcha moment. We're really trying to do this as kind of an educational moment for a lot of people watching, so you can kind of put some context in your own, and if you just want some general information on how these kind of things go. So this is really we know the answer, and now we're trying to see what went wrong, and we're trying to see what went well, and we're going to break it down for both of them.
So the reason we wanted to do this video is a lot of the time we talk about people needing to do needs analyses, what's involved in a needs analysis, but we think this will give you some really good context of if an athlete's sitting at the table with us or we're chatting to them over and back, these are the general kind of questions we'd ask, the topics we'd bring up. And to start this off, the first thing will be kind of body mass, body size, the general amount of weight you're carrying around with you, right? Usually in a needs analysis, the first thing you look at is just a weight number or a mass number. Thankfully, the two lads are both using kilos here. It's an interesting divergent strategy that we see from both camps that we'll talk about later on. In other needs analysis, we commonly see things like a measure of body composition, so how much percentage body fat they're carrying around. Also things like lean muscle mass and stuff will be valuable to talk about.
I figured out soon the heavier that I got, the stronger I got. So I would just eat a lot. I just ate and ate and ate and ate. Every single 2 hours I ate, I snacked. And after each meal, I was so exhausted, I would just fall asleep. Like literally sitting like this. It's crazy, but I was just so obsessed. I truly believed that the extra body weight would help me become the best, and it did. I became the best. So I was willing to sacrifice my health, which is crazy when you think about it. Now I'm somewhere between 150 something, I don't know, I'm like empty stomach in the mornings, maybe 152. Feel 10 times better, 10 times more sharper, more energy, more focused. Now I'm literally running around, you know, holding my son up in the air, you know, playing with him, and it just makes life better.
Okay, so that is Hafthor's clip. I'll just play Eddie's bit there.
Okay. So put a bit back on. I've been sitting between 155 and 158 kilo pretty much my whole camp from a year in, really. When I first started, I was 175 kilo when I first signed the contract 2 years ago. And, you know, to be 157? And in my opinion, I've kept my weight high and I've kept my strength good, my cardio's good. I believe that the bigger and stronger you are in the boxing fight, the better. I've never ever heard a boxer ever say, I wish I was weaker for that fight, or I wish I was lighter for that fight. End of the day, if the cardio is there, then I'll take it. So I think I said from the beginning I wanted to come into this about 160. Probably going to lose a couple more kilo, as you will during a camp. You know, cardio is going to get more intense in the next few weeks. And of course, being out in Dubai in the hot weather, I'll lose a couple of kilo out there as well. So I anticipate I will fight roughly, probably 152, 153 kilos.
Okay, so let's look at the kind of the biggest aspect of this fight from kind of a commercial point of view, and from a really important aspect for them to manage, as all fighters it is, but with these particular athletes it's quite a notable aspect. It's the biggest part, no pun intended. So it was advertised as the heaviest fight in boxing history. So these two athletes combined obviously were I assume we'll probably never see a fight like this again in terms of weight management.
I hope not.
I hope not. So let's look at some of the pros and cons of being heavier for this fight. So you'll have seen some of those clips where Eddie Hall is talking about coming in really powerful, and then the opposite side of things, we'll have seen Hafthor talking about getting lighter and feeling a lot better. So some of the kind of good aspects in relation to this fight, what is the benefit for them being heavier? So they'll have better absorption of punches to a certain extent. So absorbing punches to the midline, which we actually didn't really end up seeing much of, and potentially to a certain extent absorption of punches to the head. So fat-free mass in the neck is very, very useful in relation to concussions. However, fat-free mass plus the addition of fat tissue can actually exacerbate concussions when taking blows to the head. So it's quite a nuanced part of that. So being heavier doesn't guarantee you will have any more resilience in concussions. However, in terms of force absorption, you have a larger surface area, there's more weight behind you to resist punches. So that's kind of some of the benefits we'll have seen from the kind of being heavier, and the good side of those things. Obviously, ability then to deal out punches could potentially be better, but there's like an asterisk next to that. So the more mass you have to dole out those punches, the potential, if you can move it fast enough, the better your knockout power could be. And obviously in this scenario, as either one of these opponents was quite heavier, it is notable not to be in a certain distance away. You don't want to be a large weight distribution away, or you don't want to be a large weight distance away from your opponent. But this also needs to be then balanced, as we'll get to in a minute, on how your own attributes play out with this weight management. Now let's get to the bad side of things of being heavier for your own particular height. So obviously Eddie is not a short person, he's 6'2", but in comparison to Hafthor, he is 6'9", I think. So their actual weights that end up being, you know, in conjunction with their genetics and their diet and their previous training history should be different. So the bad aspects of being heavier than you should be, now that should be is in inverted commas because it's not an exact science, but we need to look at a variety of different qualities. However, let's imagine this scenario, you ended up over that ideal fight weight, so you have lower quality of movement as your efficiency is lower. Your efficiency will be lower because of your aerobic capacity being reduced due to having more just mass to be moving around the place, even though in addition to this mass, some of this mass will be doing the moving. This mass in itself has its own weight and requires moving, in addition then to the extra fat mass we will also have that will require movement as well. So if we look at, for example, a study from 2014, the impact of body weight and aerobic capacity, in a very, very short synopsis, more body weight had an inverse relationship, a negative inverse relationship with our VO2 max. And our VO2 max is very, very useful in relation to judging what our aerobic capacity is. Now in boxing, aerobic capacity is massively useful. Another aspect then in relation to this efficiency and aerobic capacity is our speed of movement. Like we're talking about, you have to do a lot of repetitions, and the more weight you have, the more costly every repetition will be. If you were, for example, are 10 or 20 kilos lighter, the speed of our movement will be a lot slower unless you're able to train these particular attributes that would be useful. But the heavier you get, the harder it is for you, regardless of how good your fast twitch fiber and your motor sequencing is. Ultimately, it becomes more costly and it becomes less efficient if you're outside that ideal weight range. The last aspect then of being too heavy is a very important aspect, and it's not something we think about a lot, but their general wear and tear during training, if you're over your ideal weight or more optimal weight, is the actual day-to-day demands of training just end up weighing on you, because you have this extra mass. Your joints and your organs and your recoverability doesn't scale accordingly with our weight gain. So the heavier you get doesn't necessarily mean our joints will increase in density. It doesn't necessarily mean our tendons and ligaments will keep up with that proportionally. Our organs and heart, for example, we know do increase to a certain extent, and obviously both of these fighters use performance-enhancing drugs. There are certain parts of the heart will enlarge, but this is not necessarily a good thing. All of these attributes tend to be take quite a beating so as you get heavier. So lung capacity, heart, blood volume required, oxygen capacity, capillary density, like joints and ligaments and tendons, all of these take quite a beating when you get to that very, very heavy weight, and especially with the amount of movement they're doing. So previously they would have been doing stuff, strongman training, and they would have been looking at the load of their training, so like kilos lifted in a day and tons per sessions. But in this, they're looking at number of repetitions of a particular movement. A lot of these are somewhat plyometric in nature, so they're a lot more dynamic than they would have previously been used to. So in this case, this is a lot of wear and tear on their ligaments and joints, more than they would normally be accustomed to. So if you're outside that ideal weight, it's a possibility for this to be a lot more demanding. You'll have heard Hafthor in that clip talking about how he feels a lot better, how he feels a lot sharper, quality movement feels a lot better. And that's part of that too, is that you feel you're in a better environment, your body's in a better composition for this kind of ideal weight.
So when we look at what the two lads did, as I mentioned earlier, we had two very divergent strategies, right? So in both their cases, they dropped an amount of weight, or they started dropping weight immediately. In Hafthor's case, he continued dropping weight until he lost around 26% of his total body mass. So he's going from 205 kilos or 200 kilos down to around 150 kilos or just over it. You're obviously dropping a quarter of the total mass that you have in your body. Now, when you look at where that mass is dropped from, he's not going to lose bone mass, or he probably won't lose that much bone mass. He might lose some bone density over the course of 6 or 8 months. But it's probably coming from lean tissue mass and fat mass, right? So both of these things are shrinking down. And it's a really conscious effort to continue shrinking down towards that. Now, as Owen mentioned, Hafthor is a giant man, right? Eddie's not small. Hafthor is just under 7 feet tall. Being 6'9" or 6'10" and walking around on 150 kilos is very different from someone who's my height or just taller than me walking around at 150 kilos. The composition of that frame is very, very different, and how you're going to be able to move through space is really different. Now, in Eddie's case, we saw something slightly different where he began by dropping mass. He dropped from around 175 kilos down to around 155, or around 20 kilos of a drop. So this represents roughly 11% of a drop in body mass, right? So he's dropped less than half of the kind of total body mass percentage that Hafthor has, and now he actually begins to creep back up. So it's by no means these two guys immediately kind of plummeting their weight. I know at different points in Eddie's career he's been much, much heavier. He's been up around the 200 kilo mark when he's competing in World's Strongest Man. But this is a very interesting thing, right? So you hear about Hafthor wanting to be more dynamic, wanting to be lighter, constantly pushing in that direction. All of his training, which we'll talk about in a sec, seems to be pushing him in that direction. And certainly his body composition and body mass is going in that direction. In Eddie's case, though, we see something completely opposite, right? He has an initial drop off. Now he's thinking about creeping back up. He's thinking about creeping even higher than 157. He said ideally he'd like to be 160, although he foresaw some sort of weight loss coming in the last month before the fight was to go on. This raises, in my opinion, two interesting points, right? So the first point is, nobody's ever fought in boxing, bar I think one person Eddie might have talked about, Butterbean, around this kind of weight, right? That's probably no accident. There's probably a lot of athletes who could have possibly crept up there if they wanted to. It's not like boxers don't have access to performance enhancing drugs and nutrition that would allow them to get there. And it's not like you don't have genetic freaks who would certainly be very predisposed to gaining a lot of muscle, and hypertrophy being quite easy to them. So you have to look at that in the first case and see, why has nobody fought at 150 or 160 kilos before, or why do a lot of people not fight there? And success generally leaves clues. If we're not seeing a lot of super heavyweights getting up around there, there's probably a reason for that, aside from weight classes and those things. The next thing you have to look at is that drop off that Eddie's expecting in the last month of camp, right? So one reason he talks about it is the fact that he said his cardio will be getting more intense. That's something we're going to talk about in a second, and why that might not be the best thing. But the next thing we have to look at is, what are you really doing with your prep if you're expecting a major drop or change in body weight a month out from the fight? So technically, when we're planning out training cycles, it's very different if we have to cut to a weight class, which you'd see in boxing, in many fight sports, you'd see it in weightlifting and powerlifting, where the cut down in the last week, 2 weeks of training is really common. In a case like this, though, you don't really want to be changing body mass massively in the last week, 3 weeks or 4 weeks of training. really what you want is to have achieved that body mass figure a number of weeks out from the fight, and then you just maintain that so you can make the most out of your training, your technical aspects. You need to make sure that travel isn't going to have any effect. So obviously both of these guys are flying to Dubai for the fight. The last thing you want to be is to be cutting weight on the plane, and you don't really want to be acclimatizing to weather and to different time zones while trying to make changes in body mass. So that is two very, very different approaches, and it's just interesting why both of these guys went down these kind of different avenues.
So probably in this scenario, we would have been looking at Eddie getting closer to the 130 kilo mark as opposed to that 150 kind of mark where he ended up in. Now, every kilo has a proportionate demand on your VO2 max, so that 20 odd kilos would have a very significant, very beneficial demand on his aerobic capacity. So if we talk, like Dara talked about there, Hafthor dropped 25% of his mass, whereas Eddie only dropped 11% of his mass. If Eddie had put in that kind of 20% drop, he would have been in the upper around the region of like 130 kilos plus or minus a kilo or two maybe. So if you look at how much they ended up dropping from their kind of heaviest days and what he started this fight at, so Eddie said when he signed the contract he was 175 kilos and ended up at only like 157 where he weighed himself in this video. Now I know he got a little bit lighter, but this is that kind of training weight where all this effect is taking place. So your weight at the fight means something, but the weight you're actually at in training means a lot more, because that's where all that effect comes from, and then that's what will be realized once you get to competition day. So in this scenario, I think if you look at even Hafthor's physique, I don't think he could have gotten any lighter and justified it, judging by how lean he looked in his conditioning. But then if we look at Eddie, not making this from a physique contest point of view, it looks like he could have probably lost a few more kilos. But if we look at it from those metrics, and then we look at the final fight conditioning, it certainly seems like he could have lost a bit more, I think, and been effective.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and obviously this is one fight we get to look at, and these are a number of videos we get to see from different media outlets, right? But so we can't say 100%. But when you look at the final fight and you look at the general stature and the general movement of both boxers by the end of it, or both strongmen by the end of it, you see Eddie being very flat-footed instead of a kind of bouncing and a generally dynamic movement around the ring. You tend to see a step or a shuffle step from side to side. Change of direction, change of stance seemed to be very, very difficult for Eddie as the fight went on. And then obviously there is massive differences in their two stances and their two approaches. But Eddie definitely looked the flatter of the two fighters. And bodyweight really wouldn't help with that.
So next we need to move on to the first part of strength and conditioning, and that is their strength training. So we're going to break this down into their strength training, what they did, and their conditioning. Now again, as we mentioned, just to reiterate, we don't have absolutely every single session, but we've quite a bit of YouTube content and Instagram content from both of them to get an idea, and we've got some words of them describing what they were looking for in their training. So first off, let's look at what Eddie did. So we'll get to what we think they needed to have done, or what's important for them to look at in their strength training in the last 2 years. But we'll just have a look at what they did, or kind of an examples of what they did. From Eddie's point of view, he's a lot of S&C conditioning sessions up on his YouTube, a lot of strength training. So primarily what we've seen is a lot of heavy box squats, a lot of incline pressing from him, a lot of safety bar box squats, and then we've seen some isolation movement work, some rotational work, and some iron neck stuff. So kind of, neck hypertrophy work. Now, interestingly, on the opposite side of things, we haven't seen a whole lot of S&C work, or specifically strength training work, from Hafthor.
400, that's a lot considering you haven't been having for how long? 7-8 months? I think maybe 350, I mean, I could, if I would start to train heavy again, eat more, I would go to 400 kilograms deadlift very, very fast. But I'm just like being realistic. I'm still lifting in the gym. I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying the work. I'm actually training more than I did that when I was in strongman. I'm more in the gym now because I'm doing all this boxing plus lifting weights plus cardio. So I feel like it's hard because, you know, I have a son and, you know, family, and they obviously are a big priority to my life as well. So I need to like really like have the sessions high paced, like go in, work, get home, spend time with family, eat, get back in, work, eat and go home, you know. So it's like bam, 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 you know.
I'm doing everything I can to push myself absolutely to the limits so I can peak at the right time. Yeah.
And the power is already there.
The power is there, so I don't need to do too much there, but enough of talking, let's start working.
Let's do it. Now we have a couple of things, there's a couple of clues to lead us to what he was doing, a couple of words of him talking about that. For example, in one clip, he's talking about what do you think he could deadlift after losing 110 pounds, which is something like 40 odd kilos. And he's saying if he gained a bit of weight and he trained, he could probably get back to 400 kilos, but absolutely balls out at the moment. In this particular time when he was talking about this, at that much lighter body weight, he said max probably 350. But in other clips then he talks about how lifting is a secondary objective for him for this. So his prime goal is boxing plus lifting, you know, training plus lifting, conditioning plus boxing and stuff. So that lifting, the actual strength training aspect of his training is very, very low. So if we've got kind of two different approaches here, looking at this just from kind of a, I suppose, more of an opinion parts of this section, is it looked like Eddie put a lot of effort and a lot of sessions, judging by the number of those and listening to him talking about it in his training. He did a lot of strength training sessions and put a lot of work into those. Now that not necessarily be a bad thing, but we'll get to that in a second.
The first thing you have to look at when we look at what should you do in this ideal case, right? If there's another fight coming up tomorrow and you have two other world strongest men competitors competing, and you look at their strength training, what they look to be doing with their strength training. Well, the first thing they do for their strength work, or why they keep going with their strength work, is they need to ensure that they're resilient to this heightened volume of cardiovascular work, right? So the most common injuries we'll see when people start increasing their volume of cardio work is we'll start seeing RSI injuries, so repetitive strain injuries, like calf issues, shin splints. You'll see issues with the elbows and the shoulders, particularly in striking. You'll see those issues, and all of that strength work, or a portion of that strength work, will start to gradually allow them to adapt to handle more and more volume in that kind of higher end cardio capacity style pieces, right? The strength work is really important in those areas. The second thing you have to look at is these guys are moving from being really big, powerful, but quite slow athletes into being big, powerful, and as fast as possible athletes. So it's a really different demand on their joints, particularly their shoulders, their elbows, things like their knees and hips as well, though. So instead of them squatting 300 kilos or 350 kilos for reps, they're now going to have to do as quick as possible a punch. We saw issues with a bicep tear in Eddie. I've no doubt that there was other issues with kind of small muscle tears, small tendon and ligament issues, where those joints just really aren't used to moving at those kind of velocities. People oftentimes think that top end strength and top end velocity are going to put the same kind of stresses on the joints, same stresses on the fascia, the tendons and all these things. In fact, those two demands are very, very different, right? So in the way the fascia interacts, in the way the tendon interacts with the muscle and the bone, these demands are very, very different. And most of your strength training, in terms of your injury prevention work, is going to be kind of bulletproofing those joints around it. So that would be ideal case scenario. You'd have somebody who's now very resilient to high-end aerobic capacity work, and you'd have somebody who's very resilient to a lot of boxing and fast-moving stuff. The last thing you'd probably look at is just maintaining strength and power numbers for these athletes, right? They're already 3 times stronger and 3 times more powerful than most heavyweight boxers are ever going to be, right? Most heavyweight boxers are never going to deadlift 250 kilos, not a mind 500 kilos or 501 kilos. So the main strength work they'll do will just be maintaining a portion of their strength, and it will never actually, or it should never actually be putting real training capital into them maintaining a majority of their strength or a majority of their power, because they're already way, way above where they need to be.
These are basically two of the strongest men to probably have ever lived or likely will ever live, you know. So their strength training attribute is so far in excess of what they'll ever need, just like Fitz said, that they could have effectively in some ways basically not have strength trained for the last 2 years and still had more than enough reserve strength to do what they needed to do. They don't possess the technique to express their strength enough in a place that it would matter. So any amount of increase in their strength training or their actual strength training movements would have been very, very little value in this circumstance. Now, this is quite unique. Very often with combat sports athletes, they have a large deficit in their force production. But when it comes to these two gentlemen, they're quite unique in this regard. Primarily, their goals for their strength training would have been just maintenance of muscle mass and those few other points that Dara mentioned there. So they're not really looking to improve on something. The strength training as a kind of importance factor is very low down the list of the things they need to be concerned about. Honestly, there isn't a whole lot of negatives from their strength training because it didn't really matter what they did. As long as they did some kind of strength training, they maintained a lot of the benefits, or they maintained most of the benefits they would have needed for boxing. So any amount of strength training for them would have kind of kept that taking over due to their predisposition to strength training, their past training history, and of course their performance enhancing drug use would have made this very, very easy to maintain. In fact, given their history use, their performance enhancing drug history, the use of performance enhancing drugs while training for this probably would have maintained all of the strength they would have ever needed without ever having to actually go to the gym. In addition to that, the muscle mass maintenance would have been quite high from both of those scenarios. An important aspect to remember when they're cutting weight is the addition of hypertrophy work, which we've seen from Hafthor. When they're cutting weight, obviously you want to be maintaining as much fat-free mass as possible, as much muscle tissue as possible, and eliminating as much kind of adipose tissue as you can to a certain extent. So one of those main things would have been maintaining muscle mass in that cut from those quite heavy weights. But as we said, those performance enhancing drugs, their past use of those, their past training would have taken care of a lot of that aspect.
A great way of thinking about this, and like, I know people we all love strength training, right? And people will immediately say, oh no, you need to keep strength training. This would be the equivalent of two multi-millionaires going into McDonald's and trying to buy themselves dinner, right? Those guys probably don't need to go to work for the next 6 months, and they'll be able to buy dinner in McDonald's or any fast food restaurant for as long as they want with the current cash they have, right? It's very unlikely that they're going to run out of cash, or in their case, run out of this massive strength surplus by not training for a while.
Running 1.5 miles in sort of 11 minutes now. I'm boxing 8 to 10 rounds fairly easily.
I used to weigh 205 kilograms at my heaviest. I figured out soon the heavier that I got, the stronger I got.
Okay, next we move on to one of probably the most crucial parts for these two gentlemen in the lead up to this fight, and the thing that would have been at the lowest attribute for them and their least proficient quality is their conditioning. So in the part 2 of their strength conditioning, this conditioning section here, if we take a look at what they did in the lead up to this fight, we kind of have two different kind of styles of conditioning, and I think it's very, very apparent. We can say definitely from the fight that Hafthor's conditioning was a lot better than Eddie's conditioning. Eddie just looked to be absolutely ragged after the first few rounds. Frequency of punching was a lot lower, quality of punches were a lot lower. If you look at Hafthor's, for example, his quality of movement was very, very consistent throughout the fight. Now, I know there's a little bit of confidence at the start likely, but that's more of a psychological and boxing aspect and sport-specific aspect. But his conditioning looked to be a lot better towards that end of that fight when it came to game day. You know, his quality movement stayed very, very high. Even though he took some knocks, his conditioning was good. He didn't drop his hands. He's very light in his feet for the whole thing. And he didn't just look to be kind of, you know, ragged and worn down. So from what we can see from what they've done to lead up to the fight, Hafthor seemed to have done quite a bit of conditioning. A lot of boxing specific conditioning, which is great to see. We have some clips of him swimming and running around the track. Now, doing these actual actions without numbers unfortunately would have been very interesting to see what kind of volume and number of sessions he was doing to lead up to the fight. Be great if we get Hafthor on, but we might never. But it'd be very interesting to see like what was the volume per session, what was the intensity. We've got him doing some very intense aerobic assault bike stuff, which is always great to see, specifically for fight work stuff as well. And then we've a lot of sport specific boxing movements, so drills, a very active movement, a lot of movement in space of a couple of minutes, which is very, very useful for conditioning. It's a requisite for conditioning, and it is something that's very useful for boxing. Now if we move on to Eddie's, we see him doing a lot of stuff like burpees. We've seen that in a few videos. I know there's been a little bit of assault bike stuff with him, but there's a clip there where he talks about running 1.5 miles in around 11 minutes. So if you're not too sure what's a typical distance for 1.5 miles walk, it's typically about 11 to 12 minutes walking 1.5 miles. So essentially Eddie was walking 1.5 miles. You know, that was 27 days out from the fight. As a metric for a boxing match, that is terrible. Just have to just say, call that as it is. That is a terrible metric. That is a very low quality of conditioning in the lead up to a fight. You could literally walk 1.5 miles in 11 or 12 minutes at a moderate to brisk pace. So I have to say, on the side of things, from the kind of looking at from what they've done in the lead up to the fight, Eddie's didn't look to be up par. And we have a lot of Eddie's sessions. He said he was swimming for 1.5 hours, but we don't really know what was in that 1.5 hours. Was that a casual 1.5 hour swim, or was that a high intensity, a lot of lengths? We don't know. If it's similar to his running pace, we know it's not too intense. And the killer for these is the conditioning.
Gareth brought up some glaring issues there, right? If to go back to the model we have of like, if we were designing this and if we had someone across the table from us, what this might look like, we'd clearly go with a block periodization model for something like this. You know, like a concurrent model of trying to get better at everything at the same time would certainly work. But when you have these defined timelines, and obviously the flight was moved a few times, but you always know the rough date it's going to be, it's much better to plan these out in kind of multi-phasic blocks, right? So you'd start off with something which would actually be a pre-prep phase, right? So before these guys would even go into a prep phase, they'd have a pre-prep phase. This would do the things we talked about earlier, preparing the joints, making sure the bodies were actually suitable to be going into these kind of higher end conditioning pieces or these higher volume conditioning pieces, and making sure you weren't going to get any of the injuries. A pre-prep phase in this case will probably only last around 4 weeks. You know, you're looking for small adaptations in very specific areas. Running alongside this pre-prep phase, it obviously have boxing practice. So it's not like you'd ever delay your start of boxing practice or boxing training. That is priority number one. But you would run the pre-prep phase first. So pre-prep phase plus boxing training. Your prep phase then, and what that would look like and how you might prepare to get somebody into this kind of cardio shape you'd want. The first thing you'd start off with is long, slow distance. So this might be, in their case, probably cycling or swimming a long, slow distance. You're probably not going to get them running on a track initially because the body weights are so high. You certainly wouldn't get them running long, slow distance on a road or on a hard surface because you're just asking for trouble in this case. You might get them on stationary bikes. You might even get them on walking treadmills. All these things will be very kind of facilitative of them doing a lot of work over a long time. These sessions will be kind of 45 minutes to an hour. The heart rate would be around 60-65% of 1RM or of max heart rate, possibly even lower. and then you're running that with your boxing practice the whole time. Then when you get out of your prep phase and you might go into what you call phase 1, or in this case we'll call it phase 1, you'll slowly start to titrate out that long slow distance. It probably won't be as important. You might look at a frequency of once per week for those kind of longer cycles, longer swims. You then add in some sort of just general strength and conditioning workouts, right? What you saw Eddie doing with his burpees, with his foot movement stuff, this would be kind of like CrossFit gym-esque, the initial phases of high intensity interval training, really general movements. The next thing you'd add in that first phase would be some boxing specific conditioning. So this is an interesting one. We see some of it in a Hafthor's video where you're doing boxing style movements. Your stance might be in a boxing stance. You might be shadow boxing, you might be hitting pads, but you're developing these kind of specific areas of cardiovascular conditioning. It's not vital, it's not as important as the other stuff we have in phase 1, but this is where you'd start to see those boxing specific workouts coming in. Now it's important to note at this point as well that in your boxing training, you're probably going to be able to handle a lot more volume. So when they're working with their boxing coaches, they're doing their sparring rounds, their pad work, their capacity for these will have increased because of the initial 2 phases of training. And now that actual boxing training will be adding into their overall cardiovascular conditioning training, because it's gone from just being this kind of quasi-intellectual area where we're just learning the movements, you're learning how to move around, and now you're suddenly at a point where you can move around effectively, you're able to do an amount of rounds in training that actually matters to your training, and now that's going to increase on top of your cardio work as well. The last phase of training, in this case we could call it phase 2, or you could call it your fight camp training. You'd see a lot of, in a general sense, you'd see a lot of high intensity interval training. This might come on assault bikes, this might be general kind of Metcon style movements. What you then see is your boxing cardio workouts will be very, very difficult, right? We saw Hafthor talking about doing 6 rounds with a sparring partner and then 4 rounds on the pad straight away afterwards. This is when you'd start to see the Shark Tank type stuff where you get boxing partner in for a sparring round. Once that sparring round is over, you get a fresh partner in, another sparring round. Once that round's over, fresh sparring partner in. You're really condensing the training, increasing the intensity of the training, and you probably see an overall dropping in total volume of cardiovascular work during these phases. That's roughly what a good kind of camp would look like, what a good periodized plan would look like for boxing. One thing I haven't mentioned is they'd probably be doing some slight local muscular endurance. So in Eddie's case, or in cases where you see shorter boxers going against taller boxers, you'd have famously seen it in Hay against the Klitschko's, practicing that upward punch, so really conditioning that anterior deltoid to be used to just holding those hands a small bit higher, throwing those punches a small bit higher, and just making sure that kind of specific area of your fight that's coming up won't catch you out.
So like there's an analogy where they're millionaires going into McDonald's in regards to their strength training. They are homeless paupers with no money when it comes to conditioning. They're going into McDonald's trying to buy anything. So when they started this day 1, when they signed that fight, when Hafthor did his 501 deadlift and they were both getting ready for this, they are paupers, they're homeless peasants when it comes to this scenario of conditioning. So they really, this would be priority number 1, was getting stuff in the bank from day 1. So you disregard all your strength training essentially, and to a certain extent even the boxing stuff initially. So you'd be getting the boxing practice in, but like Dara said, it's just familiarization with the movements, learning those movements, but really hammering that condition, because they have such a deficit of conditioning to bring up, and it's the most important aspect for them to bring up in some circumstances. So no matter how good a boxing they were, if their conditioning was not in shape, and we've seen this from loads of great boxers, if they come into a fight not in shape, it's irrelevant how good their skill is, because if they fight someone of equal skill to them, it's going to be, you know, a huge deficit for them if they're not in good conditioning. So when they started this fight, the most important thing you would have started doing was prepping all that groundwork for their conditioning, getting in there early, doing as much of it as you can possibly manage without injuring the athlete or overloading them, and still giving them time to lose weight and also learn that boxing. So this has been the big one, and I think this really showed at the end after, you know, 2 years or so. So the last bit we're going to talk about is a little bit more of an abstract concept, and that is kind of the environment these two athletes put themselves in to prep for this fight. So we all know in combat sports that fight camp is a huge aspect. A lot of fighters will talk about how important it is to get into fight shape and going into camp, and this is a huge cultural thing with boxing specifically, but I will see it a lot in MMA fighting, where going into a camp is a very important aspect, and a lot of fighters will put a lot of kind of reverence to it. They'll put a lot of emphasis on that, and so it's no different necessarily for those two fighters. They're obviously in that environment, and they're looking to put themselves in a situation where they can make the best possible progress. So it's like a national training center for weightlifting, or a very tight-knit powerlifting club for powerlifting. You know, it's very, very important to put yourself in that environment. So if we look at what these two fighters did, we saw, for example, Eddie had his home gym built. He did almost all of his training, from what you can see, exclusively in his home gym. Now I know a lot of that had to do with COVID, for example, so we might forgive it there. So a lot of he had his boxing ring in his home gym. He had his, you know, S&C stuff in his home gym. He had his buddy training with him in his S&C and kind of overseeing his S&C with him. He was really insulated in that environment. You know, he just went downstairs from his house into his own gym. Now if you look at what Hafthor did, for example, we have him getting, you know, a very high level boxing coach, from what we understand, someone who knows what they're doing, someone who's trained world champions, and we've seen bringing in a fighter from Glasgow here, and there's a clip of him talking about it, and they didn't know each other, they weren't friends. This gentleman certainly looks like a boxer, and I don't know how else to describe that, but he looks like he knows what he's doing with boxing. So he's in that situation, and he said Hafthor's come on a lot. He said they're living in the gym, they're just in the gym, and this was March of this year leading up to the fight, a really important time for this. So we've got two different situations there, where we have Hafthor in another clip talking about how this was his job, and it's very important for him to get in, get his work done, get training done. You know, he has family requirements, he's got to treat this like a job. He's doing more training than he's ever been doing in comparison to strongman, and he's getting into the gym, and he is treating it like a job in a different environment.
So in terms of the psychology of this, there's interesting things going on, right? So you've got two guys who are right at the top of their game in their sports. They're at different points, they've both been the strongest man in the world. At different points, they've both held the heaviest deadlift in history, right? So you've got these two guys who are top of the hill, king of the hill, whatever. And now they're coming into a completely new sport. They're relatively unskilled in this new sport, and it's really interesting to see the two differences, right? If it was me, I would want to take that world champion, take them out of their comfort zone, put them into a new area, right, where they're able to learn. They're not being kind of intruded upon by any previous history with training or previous history with performance, so they won't want to just go back to their old style of training, or they won't want to just keep lifting heavy weights or squatting all the time. And also you have to understand that these guys know a hell of a lot about their own sport, right? They obviously have coaches and stuff helping them out, but they are some of the best athletes in the world in that sport. But when you come into a new sport, that experience doesn't really count for anything, right? You obviously have the experience of knowing what a good athlete is, what you have to do, what your job is, but you really just want a clean slate. Ideally, you wouldn't want any athlete to be talking back to a coach. You'd want them to just sit there with open ears. And I think the fully immersive camp setup and the fully immersive coaching and sparring partner setup, where you go to somebody else's gym, you go to a coach and to a sparring partner, and just work with them exclusively. I think that is a much better setup than kind of bringing people into your fold. Like, from the outside looking in, it appears as if Hafthor went into the boxing world. From the outside looking in, it looked like Eddie Hall brought some of the boxing world into his world already. So that is interesting for me as a sports psychologist. It's just two differing approaches again. And in my opinion, one of them just seems to be a bit better. So if you're not the world's strongest man, which you're probably not, because not all of us can be, we do have a strength training for combat athletes training program. It's 10 weeks long. First 6 weeks of that is a strength training block. The last 4 weeks of that is a power production block. So it gets you really, really well prepped, particularly if you have a fight coming up in kind of 11, 12 weeks time. this will be the perfect 10 weeks of strength training to lead up to that, and then you have your 2-week taper after that. If you have questions about that, pop them in the comments down below. If you like this style of video, even though you mightn't like my voice, but hopefully it'll be fixed by next week, do pop them in the comments down below. Liking, sharing, subscribing and all that stuff is really appreciated.